Greenwich is one of the oldest towns in Connecticut, full of rich history and culture. Only a 15-minute train ride to New York City, this coastal town gives you the charming New England feel, as well as the vibrant and exciting city life. The members of Belhaven community were known for their class and power, and no one would have ever suspected that such an affluent society would get their hands tainted behind the barbed golden doors. Social butterfly Martha Elizabeth Moxley was known for her extroverted, fun-loving nature. Born to Dorothy and John David Moxley on August 16, 1960, was the youngest member of the family along with her elder brother John. After Martha's dad got transferred from his job at Piedmont, California in 1974, the whole family moved out to a spacious new mansion in Connecticut. Moving 3,000 miles away from her home into the wealthy suburbs of Belhaven might have been a big change for everyone. But Martha was very adaptable. Within a very short span of time, she made quite a few friends, and classmates were often drawn towards her vivacious personality and self-confidence. Within the short 9 months in town, she was already voted out the most popular girl at Western Junior High School. Martha's swift gain of popularity also got her famous with the boys. Martha was a person who had everything in the world going for her. She was known to be friendly, athletic, and talented in the arts. Everything seemed to come very easily to Martha. Her brother John recalled in an interview, "She was very easy to get along with, upbeat, friendly, the kind of kid you'd like to be around." Despite her raging popularity, Martha was described to be a family-oriented person. She would often spend her time around the house making sketches or playing with Tiger, her cat. But just like any other teenage kid, she too had a wilder side. In the summer of 1975, Martha would spend most of her days at the Belhaven Club playing tennis or just idly swimming. She would often socialize around the pool with other children of exclusive clubs. The kids of these clubs were described to be of a different breed, unlike her other friends. They went to private academies and boarding schools and enjoyed a wealth that was daunting, even by Greenwich standards. Amongst these kids, one family especially stood out, and that was the Skakel family, cousins to the infamous Kennedys. Martha was known to share close connections with the Skakel boys, Thomas and Michael. The Skakels were neighbors to the Moxley family. Michael and Thomas Skakel were both nephews of Ethel Skakel and her husband Robert F. Kennedy. The families related to, and Robert happened to be the brother of the late President John F. Kennedy. Ethel Skakel's brother, Rushton, and his wife, and had 7 children. Amongst them were Thomas and Michael Skakel, who were 17 and 15-year-old respectively. At the time of Martha's murder in 1975, the Skakels were far from a happy family. Michael Skakel would later cite chronic illness, alcoholism, and a repressive Catholic morale and sexual outlook as persistent causes for household turmoil. In 1973, Ann Skakel passed away from brain cancer, leaving her alcoholic husband, Rushton Skakel, to further delve into a worse state. He would often leave the children home alone with insufficient supervision, in unlimited funds. Michael Skakel expressed that even a more intense level of chaos came to rule our household as a result of his mother's death. The Moxleys lived just about 150 yards away from them. The Skakels would often have a constant stream of teenagers at their place, thanks to the lack of parental supervision. Martha was experiencing her best summer days within the comfort of the gated community in Belhaven. Her teenage years were filled with occasional sneaking out, added with smoking and a few beers. In her diary, Martha shared a few instances that happened over the course of these holidays. Many of them were in reference to the Skakel boys, as Martha was especially concerned with the advancements she was receiving from Thomas. On September 12, 1975, she wrote, "Dear Diary, me, Jackie, Michael, Thomas, Hope, Maureen, and Andra, when driving in Tom's car, I was practically sitting on Thomas's lap. Because I was only steering. He kept putting his hands on my knee. Then I was driving again and Tom put his arm around me. He kept doing stuff like that." Martha also wrote a note about Michael on September 19, 1975, which said, "Michael was so totally out of it that he was being a real asshole in his actions and words. He kept telling me that I was leading Tom on when I don't like him except as a friend. I said, well, how about you and Jackie? You keep telling me that you don't like her and you're all over her. He doesn't understand that he can be nice to her without hanging all over her. It was quite evident that Martha had mixed feelings about the Skakel brothers and often reconsidered if she should stop hanging around their place. The doubt of her own safety and comfort kept looming over her mind, but no one could have expected what was coming next. On October 30th, 1975, mischief hour arrived. Martha did her best to convince her mother to let her out with her friends. John, Martha's dad, was out on a business trip, so she tried every trick in the book to get her mother's approval. After some consistent nagging, Dorothy fell short to her daughter's pleas and gave her permission to go out for the night. Belhaven was a well-secured community. Everyone coming in and going out was well inspected, and crimes within such a safe locality were highly unlikely. Martha went out with her friends, Jackie, Jeffrey, and Helen. The three of them went over to Skakel's place, where they were supposed to meet with Kennedy cousins. The night went on, and soon enough midnight struck. Dorothy was used to her daughter occasionally missing her curfew, so her panic didn't settle until 2 a.m. At first, she thought Martha might have just slept over at her friend's place. She called Martha's best friend Sheila in search of her whereabouts, only to find out that she hadn't seen her since 9:30 p.m., about the same time when all the kids went back home. After 3:30 a.m. rolled around, Dorothy was worried sick and decided to call their neighbor, Thomas Skakel, who also replied the same thing as Sheila. After 3:35 a.m., she finally gave up and ended up calling the police for help. The local Greenwich officers were sent to the Moxley household almost immediately. After a quick check around the neighborhood with Dorothy, they couldn't find anything out of sorts. The officers ended up giving assurance to Dorothy and asked her to wait till the morning. Although right before the officers headed back, they sent out Martha's information to all the nearby stations to stay alert for any sightings of Martha. Soon fell asleep beside the window, waiting for her daughter to show up. The following morning of October 31st, 1975, Dorothy rushed over to Martha's room, only to find her bed empty. The police were called in yet again, and a deep, unsettling feeling had started to creep over her. She knew something wasn't right. Dorothy couldn't just sit back and wait, so she decided to go around the neighborhood with her son John. And the first place she went to look was the Skakel household. Over the course of 15 months of them living here, Dorothy had never been over to her neighbor's house, and the first thing she was greeted with was their aggressive dog. Pretty shaken up from the frightening encounter, she knocked on the door, and the younger Skakel brother Michael opened it soon after. In spite of that, Dorothy was adamant to find something, so she asked to take a look over at the camper parked outside. She assumed that Martha might have just fallen asleep in the back of the camper, but after checking inside, her hopes were crushed as it was empty as well. The word of Martha's disappearance had gone around the locality by this time, and friends and neighbors had come along with the police to inspect the grounds of Belhaven. Not long after noon, Martha's friend Sheila rushed over to the Moxley household. Shivering in fear, she fumbled to come up with the words to describe what she just witnessed. Through her tears, Sheila pleaded with Martha's mom to call 911 for help. She said something terrible had happened and Martha's not moving. Someone had attacked her and they needed to get help. Dorothy's friend Jean, who was with her at the time, asked her to stay put as he went back to check on what had happened. As soon as Jean reached the site, he made a gruesome discovery. 200 feet away from her house, lying face down under a large pine tree at the edge of the Moxley property, was the missing teen. The back of her head was bludgeoned and the broken golf club was sticking right out through the back of her neck. Martha's clothes were blood-stained and her jeans and underwear were pulled down to her ankles. Near the teenager was a broken 6-iron golf club which was used to strike Martha repeatedly in the head. The impact was so forceful the club was found broken into 3 pieces. The broken golf club pieces were laying all over the ground near her body. Everything except the grip of the handle. The law enforcement officers were stunned at the discovery of the body. Greenwich hadn't experienced a violent crime case in the last 30 years, let alone something as heinous as this. The local police were highly unprepared to handle the severity of the given situation. For further thorough investigation, a team from Connecticut County Station was assigned. Forensics at the scene did their best to gather as much evidence as possible, and Martha's body was sent out for autopsy. There was no evidence of sexual assault traced during the autopsy, and the blunt force of her head was found as the initial cause of death. It was later discovered that young Martha Moxley remained a virgin till the end of her life. Whilst the investigation was ongoing, Greenwich local police officers started gathering alibis from every witness they knew to figure out the exact timeline of the homicide. The first person on the list were the Skakel brothers. The police interrogated both the boys on the same day, and they presented their respective alibis for the time of the murder. When questioned, Thomas Skakel told detectives that he last saw Martha around 9:30 p.m. outside his house. He said after he bid goodbye to her, he went straight inside, where he joined the family's new live-in tutor, Kenneth Littleton, to watch The French Connection. Thomas soon after went back to his room, later to work on a school report on Abraham Lincoln. His teachers, however, denied they had ever given such an assignment. Thomas was eventually given 2 polygraph tests. The results to the first one remained inconclusive, but Thomas passed the second one. Michael Skakel told detectives that he had left his house around 9:15 p.m. and drove to his cousin Jimmy Turin's house, returning around 11 p.m. The police immediately felt a bit doubtful towards Michael's statement, but didn't have any hard proof to pin him as a suspect to the case. 24-year-old Kenneth Littleton was also investigated in the fall of 1976. He told police he heard noises outside the house, sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Before he stepped out, Littleton said he checked up on all the 7 Skakel children, and Michael, along with his older brother Thomas and 2 other Skakel boys, were not at home during that time. According to reports by Detective Salomon, his story was that he heard some noises coming from the bushes on the property, leaves rustling, but he claimed he did not see anything at the time he was out. Littleton further added that he didn't see Thomas until 10:25, when Thomas joined him in front of the TV. The other Skakel boys came home within a half hour. Littleton reportedly had no idea who Martha Moxley was. The night of her murder was actually his first night at the Skakels. Although he failed several lie detector tests, Littleton was never charged with any connection to the case. Amidst the active investigation, police came across 2 startling pieces of evidence. Martha Moxley had been beaten and stabbed with a Tony Payne at golf club. These golf clubs were engraved with the initials of an Skakel, and upon further inspection, the same golf clubs were found at the Skakel household, but one was missing. Their father, Rushton Skakel, who previously was out for a hunting trip, rushed back home upon hearing the news of Martha's murder. Although during the beginning of the investigation, he was quite cooperative with inspections and statements, he soon halted his relations with the police. On January 22, 1976, the Skakels, on the advice of their attorneys, refused to answer any more questions and ended their family's cooperation with investigators. The second thing which raised quite a few questions were the alibis given by Martha's friends. On the evening of October 30th, 1975, Martha Moxley left with her friends to participate in Mischief Night, in which the neighborhood youths would ring bells and pull pranks such as toilet paper in houses. According to her friends, Martha was seen flirting with the oldest Skakel brother, Thomas, and was eventually found kissing him moments later. One of her friends later mentioned that they had last seen Martha falling behind the fence with Thomas near the pool in Skakel's backyard at around 9:30 p.m. There were more than 200 scheduled interviews held by detectives within the next several months. All of them were given several polygraph exams to complete the process. Donald Brown, who was the state's attorney for Fairfield County at the time of Martha's murder, said, "No one has an obligation to cooperate with the police, but in most instances, individuals who have some knowledge that may lead to the identification of an individual who has committed a violent crime are more than pleased to contribute that information to the police. So it's most unusual when an individual possessing information decides that he does not want to give that information to investigators." Initially, the case turned cold for almost 2 decades due to lack of information. In 1991, Martha Moxley's case was reopened after a rumor that another Kennedy family member, William Smith Kennedy, may have been involved in the murder. William was on trial for assault charges, and though his connections to the Martha Moxley case were later closed off, this whole ordeal ended up getting the case restarted with new leads. Within the same year, the police brought in the well-known forensic pathologist, Dr. Henry Lee. Dr. Lee was able to utilize technology that was unavailable in 1975. Among the items examined by Dr. Lee were clothes found discarded in the Skakel's garbage shortly after the murder. We found some hairs and fibers. Some of the hair is microscopically similar to hers. Other hair is dissimilar to hers. Dr. Lee determined that the hair belonged to a Caucasian male. The problem was he didn't have any hair sample from any of the possible suspects and was unable to make a match. However, after studying the crime scene photographs, Dr. Lee was able to provide a possible motive for Martha's murder. The blood smear on her body indicates somebody tried to use force. It suggests a sexually motivated homicide. Michael quickly became the prime suspect in the case. Soon after, Rushton Skakel allegedly hired a private investigator to clear his family name. Privately, he hoped information would come out, which would cast suspicion on other suspects, namely former suspect Kenneth Littleton. However, his plan completely backfired. Private investigators Jim Murphy, a former FBI agent, and his assistant Willis Billy Krebs, a former NYPD lieutenant, were both now involved in the Martha Moxley case. When the two men interviewed Tom and Michael Skakel about their activities on the night of Moxley's murder, it turned out both boys had lied to the police. Thomas Skakel had disclosed that it was not 9:30 p.m. when he last saw Martha outside his house, but actually closer to 10 p.m. Also, before Thomas went back inside, he and Martha engaged in some inappropriate activity outside his home. According to Krebs, Thomas began to cry as he admitted this, but his lawyer cut him off before any more could be said. Meanwhile, Michael Skakel told the investigator that he did not go to bed when he arrived home from his cousin's house around 11 p.m. He'd actually climbed a tree outside Martha Moxley's bedroom window and engaged in some inappropriate activity. Author and journalist Dominic Doon got a hold of the investigator's report and passed it on to State Inspectors Frank Garr, who had previously been a detective on the case. Though he shared his suspicion about Michael Skakel previously, due to lack of information, it was dismissed. This report would give his theory new momentum. Leonard Levitt, an investigative reporter for the Long Island-based Newsday, covered the Moxley case in 1982. He also shared a similar theory about Michael. He shared that there were no defense wounds, which indicates she knew her attacker. Merely the fact that she was hit repeatedly with a golf club indicates some kind of rage, which personalized this thing, which indicates that there was such anger that the two had to have known each other, that it was a crime of passion. Levitt waited for 20 years to report on Martha Moxley. The report said Thomas and Michael Skakel had made startling admissions to the detectives. Both Thomas and Michael told the investigators that they had lied to the police about their accounts the night of the murder. Thomas said to them that after 9:30, he went inside his house and then he went back out and spent another 20 minutes with Martha. He claims now that he and Martha engaged in a sexual act and then he left her at about 10 to 10. If you go back now and you look at the story that he told, it just doesn't add up. In 1998, a one-man grand jury and an investigator were assigned to review the case of Martha Moxley. Upon examining the evidence, Judge George N. Thim ruled that there was enough to charge Michael Skakel with her murder. Michael was prosecuted with the charges of Martha's murder in his late 30s. It took the court almost 2 long decades to give justice at last. He was convicted after a 3-week trial that relied largely on circumstantial evidence. Investigators had recovered part of the golf club, a 6-iron from a set that had belonged to Michael's mother. But unfortunately, prosecutors had no direct physical evidence to tie Michael with the murder investigation. He claimed he was miles away from the murder scene at a cousin's place, where they watched Monty Python's Flying Circus. Even so, jurors later said they were convinced by the incriminating statements he had made, as well as his erratic behavior. Several former classmates of Skakel's later testified for the trial. Apparently, when Michael was in Elon School, a specialty school aimed at rehabilitating troubled youths, he had even confessed to them about Martha's murder. One former schoolmate, Gregory Coleman, testified in the pretrial hearing in June 2000 that Skakel told him that "I'm going to get away with murder. I am a Kennedy." Coleman went on to say that he, Michael, had made a comment that he was trying to make advances towards this girl, and that this girl was not complying with those advances and thus he drove her skull in. However, Coleman did not return to testify in Michael's murder trial in 2002, as he died in August 2001 of a heroin overdose. Michael, in particular, was known to have a troubling past. Though the Skakel's secrets were well hidden, rumors of Michael's stay within the walls of Elon's school caused quite an uproar. During a group session at his reform school, Michael let out a confession that he was the one who murdered Martha during the night of October 30th. However, the school's owner, Joe Reese, denied any such statements ever being made. Despite this were countless witness accounts who confirmed the story. During the Skakel trial, 2 of Michael's former classmates from Elon School came forward as witnesses. One of them was John D. Higgins. Higgins described the ordeal to be a tearful, dazed, and confused confession, where Michael said he only remembers fragments of his memories of the crime, whereas Gregory Coleman, the other witness, said Michael quite brazenly stated that he was sure he would get away with Martha's murder, due to his family name. After Michael Skakel was sent off to prison in August 2002, his cousin Robert Kennedy Jr. became a staunchest supporter. He solely believed that his cousin never committed the murder and was entirely getting framed due to political propaganda. "I know Michael Skakel and I know he didn't commit this crime," Kennedy said in his interview with CBS 48 Hours. In 1997, Michael Skakel made recordings with a ghostwriter Richard Hoffman for his autobiography, Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. One specific recording played during the trial was particularly damning. Michael said that the night of Martha's murder, he was drunk, had been smoking marijuana, and was having inappropriate urges. When Dorothy Moxley came to his door that morning, Skakel panicked. He said on the recording, "I was still high from the night before, a little drunk." He reported having thought to himself, "Did they see me last night?" Michael claimed he was worried that anyone from the Moxley household might catch him in the act. He said that he engaged in some inappropriate acts while he was on their tree, but prosecutors argued that Michael was actually referring to being seen beating Martha with a golf club. The counter-argument from Michael's defense was that there was no physical evidence to convict him and that he had an alibi for the time frame in which Martha was murdered. Nonetheless, the prosecution used the trial to paint Michael as a jealous teen. They claim Michael was infuriated by being rejected by his crush. While he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol and with access to the murder weapon, he ended up acting on his thoughts. On June 7, 2002, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Skakel was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The jury and state superior court announced their verdict just after 10:30 a.m., shortly after starting its 4th day of deliberations. Rushed and Skakel appeared almost stunned, as the foreman pronounced the verdict in the packed silent courtroom. The public rejoiced at the justice given. It was one of the most complicated and tragic cases in the Northeast, surrounded by a swirl of wealth and celebrity. The 27 years of hell finally ended for the Moxley family. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Moxley faced a huge mass of reporters and television crews. Through tears, Mrs. Moxley said she had prayed before court. "My prayer started out, 'Dear Lord,' again today like I have been doing for 27 years. I'm praying that I can find justice for Martha. You know, this whole thing was about Martha." She added, "This is Martha's day. This is truly Martha's day." While Michael was in prison, his lawyers and supporters fought for his conviction to be overturned. For appeals were filed, all of which were denied. Then, on October 23, 2013, Michael was granted a new trial on the basis that his defense attorney Mickey Sherman provided him with constitutionally deficient representation. As a result, Skakel was released on $1.2 million bail on November 21, 2013. Prosecutors fought their best to get Skakel's conviction reinstated. They succeeded years later in December 2016. Connecticut Supreme Court finally ruled over a 4-3 decision, which said his representation was in fact valid. But the case didn't close there. In May 2018, the court reversed its ruling with yet another 4-3 decision, concluding that Michael's representative Mickey Sherman failed to provide evidence of Michael's alibi during the original trial. Prosecutors still have the option to retry Michael, but will certainly have difficulty doing so due to deceased witnesses and other problems. Michael's legal team in an issued statement praised the court's decision, saying that it had done the right thing. The lawyers also said that Michael, who maintains that he is innocent, has been unjustly imprisoned. The Moxleys, however, remain certain of Michael's guilt. "There's no doubt in my mind that he did it," Dorothy said. John Moxley, her 59-year-old son, said that the jury's verdict in the 2002 trial, which they reached after hearing the evidence against Michael Skakel, continued to give him reassurance. "There's a comfort level on our part that we know what happened," he said. Michael Skakel is now 55 and lives with his aunt in Westchester County, New York. He spends his day taking care of his 15-year-old son, George, and doing his best to move on from the trauma of his past conviction and imprisonment. He's legally bound to ask for court's permission to travel outside Connecticut or New York. "I'd like to put this nightmare behind me so I can begin to have some semblance of a life with George, without all of this hanging over my head," he said in the email. "I lost 11 and a half years of my life. I miss George's childhood altogether. I know I will never get those years back, but I feel lucky to spend time with George now." The death of Martha Moxley was a recurring nightmare for the Greenwich community and her family and friends, which lasted over 40 long years. While many still believe in favor of the court's justice, that the verdict against Michael was fabricated. But in the end, a mother lost her daughter, and the state of Connecticut failed to get proper justice for Martha's death. Many believe Michael walked away as a free man due to his connections and wealth. Martha's father, John David Moxley, died in 1988 fighting for his daughter's justice. The Kennedy family continues to gain fame from the Martha Moxley case even now. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who wrote a book entitled Frame, Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Didn't Commit in 2016. Dorothy Moxley, Martha's 84-year-old mother, said the book had left her at a loss for words. She added that truth never looked so twisted and manipulated in her entire life. She still believed that Michael was the murderer of her child. Kennedy's book devoted an entire chapter to skewing the character of John, Martha's dad. He questioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder and raised numerous allegations on the Moxley family. Michael Skakel remains free as of December 2019. The name of Martha Moxley is etched into the hearts of Greenwich forever. A young, beautiful girl was stripped of her childhood before she could even bloom out of her teenage years. This isn't the first tragedy that has been buried by the Kennedy men. The trial between Michael and the Moxley family was a war waged by the entire United States. And while there is still much speculation on this case, we give our deepest condolences to the family of the deceased. Saugus, situated in Essex County, Massachusetts, is a charming town nestled within the vibrant Greater Boston area. This historic gem, known for its rich heritage, Saugus boasts a tapestry of historic landmarks, exceptional public services, and a thriving local business community. Although Saugus offers both its residents and visitors a warm and welcoming community with a crime rate that aligns with the national average, the town isn't safe from all the dangers. This takes us back to a night in 1992 when 27-year-old Susan Terascoitz wandered into the dark and never returned home. Susan Terascoitz, affectionately known as Sue, was born on February 13, 1965, to her parents Ron and Marlene Terascoitz. Her childhood unfolded in Saugus, Massachusetts, where she shared her formative years with her brother, Ronald, and her sister, Deborah. Throughout her high school days, Sue was both creative and authentic. She enjoyed roller skating, running track, and making art. With the remarkable talents and intelligence Sue possessed, her teachers described her as a gifted person. She had a kind and giving nature, always wanting to help others, and was seen as a good-hearted person with a warm smile. Her friends and family described her as feisty, yet warm and compassionate. She was a quiet and kind student who loved a Snoopy character from Charles Schulz's wildly famous comic strip called Peanuts. There was also a time when Sue was an inspiring cartoonist, and even traveled to San Francisco to meet Charles Schulz in person. Upon her graduation from Saugus High School in 1983, continued her educational journey, enrolling at Salem State College, North Shore Community College, and later the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Sue's life was marked by her creativity, kindness, and a determination to follow her dreams. Sue ultimately landed a job with an airlines company in 1989. Sue made history by becoming the second woman to join Northwest Airlines as a ground services employee on the ramp at Logan Airport in Boston. Working in a male-dominated airline industry, Sue faced numerous challenges, as she was often subjected to harsh treatment by her coworkers. But she was fearless when it came to displaying her capabilities and standing her ground. Her responsibilities included loading and unloading baggage and de-icing planes. Despite the occasional hectic nature of her job, Susan rarely had any complaints. During Sue's time at Northwest Airlines, she went from cleaning jet interiors to achieving yet another milestone in her career in 1992. Sue's determination and loyalty towards her work didn't go unnoticed, and she was handed the role of baggage supervisor, which made her the first woman ever to hold the position for Northwest Airlines at Logan Airport. With the barrier she broke within the airline industry, Sue's professional journey paved the way for many young women to follow their dreams. Although Sue liked working at the airport, she often found herself dreaming about becoming a firefighter someday. And soon, Sue's career path took an unexpected turn when she took the firefighter placement exam and excelled at it. She secured the 8th position on the reserve list for the Swampscott Fire Department and was hoping to join the force soon. Sue was clearly not afraid by the idea of entering other male-dominated industries. She was a career-driven woman, and she was not going to let anything stop her. Sadly, before Sue could hear back from the Swampscott Fire Department, something awful happened. Although Sue lived with her parents, her hectic work schedule often kept her busy at the airport. A lot of times Sue would work overnight and weekend shifts, which frequently took her away from her home, making her miss out on the time she would get to spend with her family. Marlene, Sue's mother, recalled that there were days when she and Sue would hardly get to see each other. Their interactions had been limited to brief passing moments. Marlene would only know that Sue was home when she noticed her work uniform left in a heap of laundry just outside her bedroom door. It was Saturday on September 12, 1992, and Sue had been scheduled to work another night shift which began at 11 p.m. and would end by 7 a.m. the next day. It was one of the busiest shifts, and Sue knew that it was going to be a long night. Although having worked for Northwest Airlines for more than 3 years, Sue had learned her way around these kind of shifts. She knew which hours would be less packed and which ones would not even let her breathe. While working her shift around 1 a.m. on September 13, 1992, Sue offered to fetch some sandwiches for her crew members. She drove her sky blue Toyota Tercel off the airport grounds and headed towards her go-to restaurant in Revere. Hours went by, but Sue never returned. Back at home that same morning, when Marlene didn't see Sue's uniform in the laundry heap, she didn't pay much attention to it. Since Sue worked overtime in the past, Marlene thought that Sue probably got caught up with and would return later. The next day, on Monday, September 14, 1992, Marlene noticed that Sue still wasn't home and the laundry pile was empty. It was unlike Sue to not come home for 2 days in a row without informing her family. That was when Marlene grew concerned and called the airport to check if Sue was okay. To her surprise, Marlene found out that Sue had never shown up for work on Monday, September 14, 1992. As fear crept in, Marlene reached out to the authorities and reported Sue missing. That same morning on Monday, September 14, 1992, a manager for Bravo Auto and Tire Service Company, which was located almost 4 miles from Logan Airport in the town of Revere, was heading to work around 7:30 a.m. driving through Lee Burbank Highway, commonly known as Route 1A. He noticed a car parked in the service's center parking lot. He couldn't recall anyone from his workplace having that car. When he walked up to the vehicle to have a closer look, he found blood dripping from the trunk of the car. He rang up the authorities to look into the matter, and shortly after, officers from Massachusetts Police Department arrived at the scene. The detectives instantly recognized the car. It was the same sky blue Toyota Tercel Marlene had described to them when she reported Sue missing. Slightly aware of what was coming next, the detectives opened the trunk and their eyes were met with a gruesome sight. 27-year-old Susan Terascoitz' blood-covered body had been crumpled up and stuffed inside to fit into the small area. Sue had bruises and stab wounds on her body, which implied that she had been beaten up before being stabbed to death. The detectives broke the tragic news to Sue's family. Ron, Sue's father, pulled himself together and held Marlene in his arms as she burst out crying. When the detectives searched the car, they found that the money Sue was going to use to buy the sandwiches was still with her. This implied that she never made it to the restaurant that night. Even though Sue had neither been robbed or assaulted, her family initially assumed that the attack on Sue was not planned. The detectives, too, at first thought that Sue's murder was a random act of violence and believed that she was killed somewhere else before being driven to the auto shop. But as the investigation progressed further, detectives found themselves uncovering a much deeper conspiracy, which led them back to Logan Airport, Sue's workplace. When questioning Sue's co-workers, detectives found out that Sue had received a phone call from someone right before she left to pick up sandwiches for her co-workers on the night before her disappearance. Finding out who this caller was became the utmost priority for the detectives. Even after spending hours conducting interviews with Sue's crewmates at Logan Airport, detectives couldn't identify who this person was. Nobody at Sue's workplace seemed to have a clue or cared enough to even ask Sue about this mysterious caller. Questioning Sue's family, neighbors, and friends wasn't of much help either. Marlene, Sue's mother, believed that Sue might have gone to meet the person who was on the other end of the phone that night, but she would never have gone alone. According to Marlene, Sue was a careful woman who was aware of the dangers that lurked in Saugus. She would never go out alone during those hours of the night. Furthermore, Sue's co-workers told the detectives that when Sue didn't come back to the airport, the thought that something bad had happened to her never struck their minds. And instead of reporting Sue missing, they marked her time card till the day her body was found. According to Sue's attendance log, she had returned from the sandwich run, left for home at the end of her shift, and returned to work the next day. When the police asked the reason behind this, they said that they were covering for her. However, Marlene was very suspicious about this. The very first question she asked Sue's co-workers was if Sue had ever done this before, if Sue ever left work and did not come back. There was a sense of regret on the faces of Sue's co-workers as they replied with a no. Marlene still couldn't understand why no one at work reported Sue missing. Extreme thoughts were taking over her mind as she sensed some sort of foul play from the co-workers. She wondered if there was a cover-up of some sort involved and asked the detectives to look closely into it. On Saturday, September 19, 1992, a funeral service for Sue was held at the Bisbee Purcell Funeral Home, 549 Lincoln Avenue in Saugus. Dozens of her loved ones gathered and mourned the loss as Sue was laid to rest. The investigation surrounding Sue's case took a serious twist when two of her co-workers, Joseph Nuzzo and Robert Bobby Brooks, were identified as potential suspects in Sue's murder. Amidst a complex web of relationships between the three of them, it was revealed that Sue and Brooks briefly shared a romantic relationship that didn't end well. Since then, Sue tried to avoid any contact with Nuzzo and Brooks because she would almost always end up getting in trouble. One time, Brooks even broke Sue's radio for no reason at all. When Sue's then-boyfriend confronted Brooks about the same, he verbally threatened him and Sue. In another incident which took place sometime in April 1989, Sue attempted to intervene in a physical altercation involving Nuzzo and two other colleagues. Nuzzo's response to this was far from appropriate. He resorted to throwing derogatory slurs aimed at Sue. The severity of his behavior led Northwest Airlines to temporarily terminate his employment, which was a much-needed action. Even during his time off, Nuzzo didn't let go of the strong grudges he held against Sue. In roughly 6 months, Brooks made an unsettling return to Northwest Airlines, gaining his employment back, all while nursing hate towards Sue for his prior dismissal. All the hatred and resentment Nuzzo harbored was unleashed as a wave of harassment directed at Sue. She vandalized her car, punctured her tires, stalked her residence, made anonymous threatening phone calls, and confided in others, including Brooks, about his desire to take revenge on Sue. The brewing tensions and ominous events painted a picture of a sinister and unsettling chapter in Sue's life. Now that the detectives had figured out what went down between Sue, Brooks, and Nuzzo, they were determined to find out more about the two men. And in no time, the detectives made yet another scandalous discovery. In the summer of 1992, Northwest Airlines had been connected to a federal investigation. As a group of cunning baggage handlers ran a stolen credit card ring, an intriguing and illicit operation came to light, which had been going on right under the nose of their unsuspecting employer at Northwest Airlines. Their scheme revolved around intercepting shipments of fresh credit cards being transported on Northwest jets. These employees weren't just handling baggage, they were running a multi-million-dollar scam. Their operation was both bold and effective. They stole the credit cards, utilized them for their own gain, going on shopping sprees until finally peddling them to eager buyers. The final tally of their gains from this fraud was staggering, reaching a jaw-dropping total of over $7 million. And not so surprisingly, the scandal was led by Joseph Nuzzo himself. As soon as Nuzzo joined the airlines again, he began stealing credit cards from mailbags. He was very careful though, making sure that nobody was watching when he did the awful deed. However, Nuzzo knew he couldn't go on forever without his employees finding out about his secret. And so he started to loop in his other crewmates along with him. Brooks became a part of it as well. By August 1992, credit card companies started asking questions, and Nuzzo and his gang could feel the noose of suspicion tightening around their necks. Later that same month, Nuzzo was fired, along with a few other baggage handlers. Nuzzo was subpoenaed by a grand jury and the case was still being looked into. Detectives investigating Sue's murder were able to link her case to the scam led by Nuzzo because of two major reasons. The first being that Nuzzo believed Sue had ratted him out to the authorities. Nuzzo didn't shy away from expressing his anger towards Sue, even though she claimed that she didn't have a clue about the fraud that had been going on. Nuzzo harassed her and warned her that if she testified against him in court, she would face severe consequences. However, the detectives' suspicions grew stronger when they learned that just 1 week after Nuzzo was fired because of the whole incident, Sue was found murdered. Even though Nuzzo denied having anything to do with Sue's murder, he was now a potential suspect in the case. But the detectives were unable to uncover any evidence that could strongly link Nuzzo to Sue's murder. With no new evidence or any potential leads, the investigation into Sue's homicide lost pace and the case eventually went cold. A year passed and there were still no signs of Sue's murderer being found. All her family had was many unanswered questions. There wasn't a day that went by when Marlene didn't think about the question, who could have wanted Sue dead? Marlene left Sue's room untouched just as she had left it. Marlene couldn't gather the strength to walk in, as it would bring back a whirlwind of Sue's memories, eventually making her realize that there weren't going to be any more of those. She tried to do so before, but the pain was too much to bear. But later in 1993, when Christmas was just around the corner, Marlene finally walked into Sue's room for the first time since her murder. She wanted to get something that belonged to Sue and reminded everyone of her, so she could put it by the Christmas tree for the holidays. Upon entering Sue's closet, Marlene's eyes fell upon her daughter's briefcase lying on the floor. She opened it, and amongst the many other things that were inside, she picked out Sue's diary. Unaware of the pain coming her way, she flipped through the diary. Her heart ached as she read the disturbing revelations Sue had penned across pages. In gut-wrenching detail, Sue had described the torture and harassment she had silently endured during her time at Northwest Airlines. These were painful incidents that Sue had never shared with her family. And as the diary bore witness to Sue's suffering, she continued to speak from beyond the grave. Within those pages, Sue had talked about the disturbing graffiti and quotes that her male coworkers had etched in the airport's men's rooms, and even the cargo holds of jets. All of those were directed at and were insulting, demeaning, and extremely malicious in nature. The extent of the cruelty and harassment detailed in Sue's diary left Marlene in complete shock. She was aware of Sue's struggles with her male colleagues, who were resistant to the idea of having a female boss. But the diary entries revealed a much graver situation than she had ever imagined. The situation grew even more distressing when Sue discovered a disturbing illustration on her own locker. The sketch showed a coffin adorned with Sue's name on it. Sue had finally had enough. She refused to suffer in silence anymore and took a stance by filing numerous formal complaints with both Northwest Airlines management and her union, hoping that there would be a better work environment for herself and the other female employees. However, the response from management proved to be deeply disheartening. Instead of addressing the issue, they offered Sue some cold advice, urging her to let it go. They even recommended her to not show any signs of being bothered by the harassment and instructed her to simply sit back and ignore it. But no good ever came from it. In the end, Sue always found herself alone and helpless, as anyone who would step in to defend her would face threats and abuse at the hands of their dominant coworkers. The harassment didn't end at the workplace. In her diary, documented a series of distressing anonymous phone calls that she received during almost all the nights she had spent at home. She even recorded a couple of those haunting calls. In one particular unnerving instance, the caller taunted Sue with the words, "Get off our backs, Sue T. Baby." When she ordered the caller to reveal their identity, the caller remained silent, adding another layer of fear and apprehension to her already troubled existence. Surprisingly, Sue's diary only covered her initial 8.5 months in her new position. However, it appeared that the discrimination against her still went on at Northwest Airlines. Even in the face of such mistreatment, her determination remained steady. She confided in friends and colleagues who stood by her side and gave her the boost to stand up against her tormentors. Sue was aware that if she resigned and walked away, it would only be a win for her male coworkers who had been harassing her. She was not going to let that happen, as it would make it even more difficult for other women to get a job here. Sue's plan was simple. She would continue to show up for work daily and diligently perform her job, making a statement that she wasn't going to give up. Amidst the shocking content, Marlene couldn't help but wonder if this relentless harassment might have played a sinister role in Sue's tragic murder. The diary was a chilling testament to what Sue had endured during her employment at the airport. And since it had shed new light on the possible motives behind the heinous crime, Marlene decided to let authorities in on this newfound information, hoping to bring justice to her daughter. The detectives arrived at Logan Airport and began questioning Northwest Airlines employees, who they suspected had been mentioned in Sue's diary. Deborah Kurb, one of Sue's co-workers, said that some men in her crew resented women in a position of authority. Some came to terms with it while the others liked it. According to Deborah, Sue was always very conscientious about her job and always tried to make it a better place to work. Sue was certain that she could make a difference for the minorities and the women who worked there. Everything Marlene read in Sue's diary inched her closer towards believing that Sue was set up by her coworkers that night on September 13, 1992. She was sure that Sue had been lured to go to the restaurant by someone she most definitely knew. According to Marlene, Sue's coworkers thought that by harassing her, they can make her quit the job and get rid of her. But when that didn't work, they resorted to doing the most horrible thing. Although the new developments in Sue's case gave detectives a new direction, they eventually led to another dead end. In 1995, Sue's family filed a lawsuit against Northwest Airlines for allegations of harassment Sue had to endure during her tenure at the company. Subsequently, both the parties involved reached a settlement. According to the terms of the agreement of the settlement, Northwest Airlines handed a $75,000 payout to Sue's estate, along with a commitment to offer a $250,000 reward to anyone who would provide any information leading to an arrest and conviction in Sue's case. The settlement became recognized because of being one of the most substantial discrimination settlements ever awarded in the state of Massachusetts. Northwest Airlines denied being a part of any foul play in the matter of Sue's murder. That same year, Nuzzo faced conviction on multiple charges associated with the credit card scheme, and he was handed a 3-year prison sentence. Brooks, on the other hand, opted to cooperate with the police and subsequently pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges linked to the scheme. He received a 3-year probation sentence. In the course of time, 10 more Northwest employees found themselves indicted and subject to varying sentences in connection with the case. Alongside some of Sue's other co-workers at Northwest, both Nuzzo and Brooks were still considered potential suspects in the homicide. Regrettably, the case went cold, leaving many questions unanswered. Although Sue's father, Ron, passed away in 2011 and Sue's brother, Ronald, passed away in 2007, Marlene still stands strong, fighting every day for her daughter. For many long years, Marlene Terascoitz remained committed to keeping her daughter in the public eye, persistently seeking answers. The identity of her daughter's caller still eludes her, a question that has continued to haunt her. Witnessing numerous other cold cases being solved in recent times has ignited a glimmer of hope within her. She is inspired to keep working towards getting justice for her long-gone daughter. It brings closure to the families, she reflected, highlighting that she still doesn't have that much needed closure. With unwavering determination, she conveyed a clear message to the person responsible for her daughter's murder, warning them to remain vigilant at all times. They can't rest easy now, since she will never give up, and one day, eventually, there will be justice. And her last message, issued on Wednesday, September 13th, 2023. Marlene Terascoitz extended a heartfelt plea to anyone who had information about Sue's case and asking them to come forward. Her quest for justice and closure for her daughter had endured many difficult years, and now she wouldn't rest until the culprit is behind bars. Marlene is in constant touch with the detectives working on Sue's case and is hopeful that someday she will be able to look her daughter's killers in the eye in court. Marlene recalled that she had shared precious moments with Sue on her 50th birthday. Marlene laughed as she reminisced about the fun night out with her family. Marlene expressed her deep gratitude for the cherished memory. Despite the underlying sadness of the situation, she found solace in the fact that that memory was linked to such a significant day, making it all the more special. On Wednesday, September 13th, 2023, the state police once again stated, they believe that some people knew about Susan Terascoitz's murder, but haven't told the police. They already had some information regarding the case, but they needed more details to be sure. They wanted anyone with information to come forward and have asked the public for help in finding the person or people involved in Sue's murder. While they haven't found any new leads in the case, they were happy that Susan's story was talked about on a podcast called The DAC. This would help keep Sue's case in the talks, and if her killer was listening, it would remind them that justice wasn't far away. Thursday, September 14th, 2023, marked 31 years since 27-year-old Susan Terascoitz's body was found in the trunk of her car. The Massachusetts State Police made it clear they were still very committed to finding the person who hurt her. Even though a long time had passed, they were still determined to catch the person responsible. As Sue's mother awaits justice, the police are actively looking for Sue's killer. They do not want to leave any stones unturned and are pursuing traditional street-level investigative methods coupled with advanced forensic techniques on the evidence they currently have. Additionally, they are reaching out to the public by creating playing cards that showcase homicide cases and missing persons. These cards are provided to state prison inmates, and the hope is that this might yield more information about the cases featured on the cards. In an old clip, Marlene urged the public to do their bit and help her out even if they had the slightest piece of information. In the last days of 1973, Deborah Kurb was a 17-year-old student at Fresno High School. Her friends and teachers described her as a cheerful and outstanding student. On December 31st, 1973, Deborah hosted a small get-together inside her family's residence located on the 4000 block of College Avenue in Fresno, California, while her parents were away in Pismo. To welcome the new year, Deborah Kurb and her friends, which included her boyfriend and another couple, engaged in puzzle solving while listening to music. When the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of the year 1974, the small party ended and the young host bid her friends farewell. Tragically, Deborah would only have a little glimpse of a potentially fruitful year. On January 1st, 1974, in the late afternoon, Deborah's parents came back home to find her lying dead with her own leotard wrapped around her neck. Tragedy was reported to the police. An investigation into the case was launched, and detectives started looking into persons who had last seen Deborah alive, specifically those who had attended her party hours earlier. A young man named James Arthur Blaylock, who was 17 years old at the time, was quickly suspected by authorities. James was one of the party attendants and had come along with his girlfriend to the gathering. He was said to have driven the others home when they left Deborah's residence. Authorities believed that James Blaylock might have committed the murder. They were of the opinion that he had gone back to the Kurb family home, using a spare key he had known the location of to get inside and rape and kill Deborah. Unfortunately, though, that was only a theory. There was no concrete proof to convict James for the crime. In 1974, due to a lack of supporting forensic equipment, detectives were unable to prove what they so firmly felt to be true: the fact that 17-year-old James Blaylock was a deadly killer. The Deborah Kurb's case slowly became cold. Many years later, in 2006, the Fresno County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation and attempted to run some of the biological evidence collected from the crime scene through recently developed DNA technology. This time, there was a success. James Blaylock's DNA matched the sexual assault kit. To further confirm this, Deborah Kurb's body was also exhumed in 2006 so that a DNA sample from her could be obtained. The samples were then submitted to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit forensic lab in California that soon confirmed James Blaylock as the culprit investigators have been looking for all these years. James Blaylock, who was incarcerated at the time, was subsequently interviewed by Fresno County Sheriff's detectives Marty Rivera and Jeff Kurtzen. He denied killing Deborah and having sex with her. Blaylock soon changed his account after the detectives confronted him with a DNA match of his semen. He claimed he and Deborah had consensual sex but never killed her. The case was brought by the district attorney's office, but it had to be dropped for lack of supporting evidence. The case went cold again for another 15 years. In December 2021, Sergio Toscano, a current cold case detective and former Fresno County Sheriff's officer, revisited the Deborah Kurb's case and asked for a repeat DNA test on the leotard used to strangle Deborah. James Blaylock's DNA results were obtained again. His DNA was confirmed on the sexual assault kit and also appeared on the leotard. After this discovery, in 2023 detectives tried to get in touch with James Blaylock, but they soon learned that he had died in the hospital in 2022. He was 66 years old at the time. Blaylock had a significant criminal history over the course of his lifetime, which included violent crimes and becoming a registered sex offender. The quiet Ohio town of Boardman was rocked by a horrifying crime early on April 4, 1972. In the Boardman Plaza neighborhood of Youngstown, Ohio, the body of a 12-year-old boy named Brad Bolino was discovered thrown in the trash can behind a dairy store. The idea that their community could experience such a tragedy astounded the locals. Since Brad had vanished on the evening of March 31, 1972, it was clear that he had met a terrible end. Who could have done this to an innocent child and why? This was the one question that was on everyone's mind as the authorities tried to make sense of the situation. Located in Ohio's Mahoning County, Boardman is a thriving community. With a populace exceeding 40,000, it holds the position of the second largest municipality within the Youngstown-Warren metropolitan area. Boardman is a center of business activity, home to a variety of eateries, retail establishments, and companies serving the local populace. The township, which dates back to the early 1800s, is home to a number of interesting landmarks, including the Southern Park Mall and Boardman Park. Based on statistical data, the crime rate in Boardman is 2.23 per 1,000 residents over the course of a typical year. It is in this city that our story today took place. Bradley Bolino, son of Joseph and Elisa Bolino, was born on April 7, 1959. He was the fourth kid they had. Brad's parents welcomed him into the world with great joy, and he soon won their hearts. Brad was the youngest member of the family, living alongside his two older brothers and older sister. Don Templeman, Brad's closest friend, recalled him as a young child who was constantly seeking out the next adventure. He was open to trying anything new and had a voracious appetite for information. He was an extrovert. Although we both liked to take risks, it was he who suggested the risk and I was the one who accepted it. Don Templeman remarked. Don and Brad were best friends for life. They were always open to taking on new challenges and had a constant love of adventure. Although it's unclear when they became best friends, it's likely that Boardman Center Middle School is where they first became acquainted. The two boys were regular bike riders in the town. They occasionally hitch rides as well, Brad being the more daring of the two. There was a rock and gem store not far from Brad's house. The two boys frequented the shop often because they were fascinated by rocks and enjoyed studying them. Their mutual love of baseball bonded them even more. When we started playing baseball together, I was the pitcher and he was the catcher and my dad was the coach, Don recalled in an interview. The two boys started spending nights at each other's houses on a regular basis over time. Being only 3 miles apart made it easy for Brad and his friend to hang out whenever they wanted. On Friday evenings, Don would usually go to Brad's house, and then walk together to the nearby movie theater. They alternated Saturdays with the boys staying the night at Applewood Acres at Don's house. They would converse and play games for hours on end long into the night. I was more naive and he was more worldly, I think, because of his older brothers. He would educate me on aspects of life I was unaware of, Don remarked. They would go to church with Don's family on Sunday mornings. Don's mom would usually offer Brad a ride home afterward. These weekends held unadulterated joy and camaraderie for Don and Brad. The two friends were fully enjoying life, taking advantage of their youth and all the adventures it had to offer. But then something unexpected happened that would completely alter the situation. Over the Easter break on Friday, March 31st, 1972, 11-year-old Don and 12-year-old Brad spent the day together. The two boys went on their customary adventures and wandered the town that Friday. But when they realized a brown van was following them everywhere they went, what had started out as a fun day quickly took a worrying turn. They dismissed it at first as a coincidence, but when they saw the van for the fourth time, their good humor turned to panic. Aware of possible danger, they made the decision to return to Don's home. Returning home also seemed prudent, especially since the sun had begun to set. After arriving at Don's home on Teakwood Drive, Brad grabbed his phone and called his brother to let him know he would be spending the night. But just as Brad was getting comfortable for what should have been a fun evening, the phone rang. The caller was his father, Joseph, who insisted on his going back home right away. Brad had to tell Don he had to leave and return home after receiving this unexpected call. Brad was unable to get a ride home from Don's mother, who was at the grocery store at the time. He was forced to return home alone because Don's father was confined to bed due to the flu. Brad bid his friend farewell and left the house at 7:30 p.m. It never occurred to Don that that would be his last encounter with his closest friend. Reported events following this are not entirely consistent. What is known, though, is that when Brad's father, Joseph, came home late that evening, he had no idea his son had gone missing. It was his assumption that Brad had returned safely from his friend's house and was sound asleep inside. However, Brad's mother, Elisa, was completely oblivious to the events taking place at home that fateful day as she worked in Cleveland. On the Saturday that followed, Joseph slept until noon. But as soon as he got up and started to go about the house, he knew something wasn't right. Brad was not in the house. Concerned, he called the Temple man's house. It didn't take him long to find out that Brad had left their home the previous evening at 7:30 p.m. He ended the call and started looking for Brad around the neighborhood, but he was unable to find him. He reported his son missing to the Boardman Police Department out of desperation. Concern was raised when word of Brad's disappearance quickly spread throughout the small town. Local newspapers joined the search after the news eventually attracted the attention of the media. In the hopes that someone would recognize the missing boy, they published a thorough description of him. According to the description, Brad weighed 80 pounds and was 48 inches tall. His short blonde hair fell just below his ears and his blue eyes were his most striking features. He was wearing blue jeans, a blue ski jacket and white tennis shoes with black stripes when he vanished. Tony D. Appolito, Brad's first cousin and a Youngstown police officer at the time, joined the search efforts in Boardman after hearing of Brad's disappearance. He was reported missing and we took to the streets, Tony said. In spite of the community's and the police's best efforts, Brad appeared to have simply disappeared. His absence created a deep hole in the hearts of his friends and family. For days after Brad went missing, on April 4th, 1972, a body was discovered. A certain sanitation worker by the name of Paul Smith was doing his usual pickup of trash. Something caught his eye as he got closer to a dumpster behind his alley's dairy store. Since the dumpster was only halfway filled, a pair of sneakers protruding at an odd angle caught his attention. When he looked more closely, he was horrified to find a small boy's body hidden under cardboard boxes and abandoned store items. Paul saw that the boy's head was hung down and that a belt was securely fastened around his neck. He had his pants down below his hips undone. Paul called the police right away to report what he had discovered. Don's house, was about 2 miles down the road from this grim discovery. There was a great sense of dread upon the Boardman police officers' arrival at the scene. When they looked inside the dumpster and saw the body inside, it looked like the missing boy they had been looking for nonstop. However, they required verification. They got in touch with Tony, Brad's cousin, who had been helping with the search, and asked him to identify the body. Tony raced to the scene, and despite his sorrow, he was able to identify Brad, his cousin, as the body in the dumpster. After this confirmation, the body was taken out of the dumpster and brought to Youngstown Southside Hospital for an autopsy. Tony, in the meantime, was given the duty of informing Brad's parents of the tragic news. It was terrible for my aunt, Elisa, and the whole family, Tony recalled. You can never move past that. You never think something like this could happen to you or a member of your family, even though you hear about it. He continued, before the start of the new school week, spent the weekend looking for Brad after he vanished. Don had heard his math teacher talking to other teachers in the hallway on the Tuesday that Brad's body was discovered. Don claims that after returning to the classroom, his teacher declared that Brad had been found. Don remembered the whole class cheering and bouncing up and down in joy. His teacher then added the devastating comment, "But he's dead." Don said that the next hour was still a blur in his memory. He did not know if he had fainted, but the next thing he could recall was asking to be sent home at the school office. The autopsy results were released to the public as Brad's bereaved family and friends struggled to process the shock of his untimely death. According to the coroner's report, Brad's body had been violated and he had been strangled to death. Additionally, the report stated that Brad had died at 9 p.m. on Saturday, April 1st, over 24 hours after his last known location. The heartbreak and despair felt by Brad's loved ones were worsened by these upsetting details from the report. Following this, an inquiry was launched to identify the culprit. There were still a lot of unanswered questions. What happened to Brad between Friday at 7:30 p.m. and Saturday at 9 p.m.? If the coroner's report was accurate, there was a 26-hour gap that remained unexplained, raising the unsettling possibility that Brad was kept in an unidentified location, or that there was another crime scene in addition to the dumpster. The last time Brad was seen was another question. According to early newspaper reports, he was spotted playing basketball on Saturday afternoon at the Southern Park Mall, the Dairy Queen near North Lima, and the area around Don's house on Matthews Road. Later reports, however, raised doubts about these sightings, speculating that witnesses may have really seen Brad on Friday at those locations. Since it was a holiday and there was no school, it was probably easy for people to mix up the days, which led to this confusion. Don would subsequently claim that it was impossible for Brad to have been seen on Saturday. Don disclosed that he and his father were brought to the station by the police as part of the investigation. There, the detective showed him Brad's outfit and inquired as to whether it matched what Brad had on when he left Don's house. Don attested to the fact that at that point they showed Don the belt that had been found around Brad's neck and asked if it belonged to Brad. Don verified that it indeed did. Don found it impossible to shake the image of the brown van they had seen the day Brad vanished. He thought that his best friend's untimely death had something to do with this strange car. "I think whoever was in that van waited until he was in a dark spot and took him," Don said. Police subsequently stated that hundreds of cars, including an orange Corvette, had been reported to them on multiple occasions, with Brad's murder being connected to them. None of these suggestions, though, produced any significant leads. The community came together for Brad's funeral as the investigation into his murder proceeded. Don was one of the guests at the crowd-filled event where standing room was scarce. Almost every student from the school, along with their parents, and even the teachers from the town, came for Brad's funeral. Don's once blissful childhood came to an abrupt end after this tragic event, and his life took on an entirely new and difficult shape. "I was very much more cautious. You believed that everyone was trying to harm you. I became very paranoid," Don remarked. 2 months after Brad's untimely death, in June 1972, Don's parents made the decision to move from Boardman to Tennessee. They were keen to get their family away from a town they felt was unsafe for their kids and one that had too many painful memories. Don's mother was plagued by guilt for a very long time. She held herself responsible for not being there to drive Brad home the night he vanished. The investigation into Brad's death didn't seem to be moving forward much over time. Months turned into years, and the detectives working on the case kept running into roadblocks despite pursuing numerous leads and interrogating numerous suspects. The case got colder every day, and Brad's chances of winning justice grew smaller. In the year 2001, Jeffrey Patterson, a Boardman former police chief, didn't let Brad's case go unsolved. He made the decision to resume the inquiry into his case. After being dispatched to the cemetery where Brad was buried, detectives meticulously dug up his body in order to collect DNA evidence. Chief Jeffrey took an important action by sending Brad's clothing, which had been kept as evidence, to the state's Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. A startling discovery was made by forensic scientists during the examination. They discovered a DNA that wasn't Brad's. The investigation gained new hope from this discovery. Two detectives, Jack Nichols and Robert Rook, were given the case as a new assignment in 2007 by Jeffrey, the former chief of police. Nichols was only 14 years old when the terrible event happened back in 1972, and he had grown up in the same neighborhood where Brad went missing. He had been thinking about the case for years, and now he could finally pursue justice in Brad's honor. As soon as the case was given to Nichols and Rupp, they went to work. Their first assignment was to sort through a ton of documents and multiple boxes full of jumbled evidence. Though it was an overwhelming task, they were committed to sorting everything out. As they went through the files, they noticed that 7 people's names kept coming up. These 7 people were designated as persons of interest. Despite the lack of hard evidence linking them to the crime, Nichols and Rupp remained persistent. They got search warrants quickly and got to work. During the search warrants, they collected DNA samples from each of the persons of interest. After that, these samples were sent to the lab for examination in the hopes of matching the DNA found on Brad's clothes. Unfortunately, the negative lab results crushed their hopes. No match was found. The detectives were back to the beginning after this setback. However, they never stopped carefully going through the case files in an effort to find any fresh leads. Sadly, in spite of their unwavering efforts, they were unsuccessful. "We had a lot of guesses and speculations, but no solid information," Nichols stated. Detectives Nichols and Rupp retired in 2017 after years of dedicated work on the case, and a new team took over the investigation. Albert Kirkasek, a highly experienced police captain from Boardman, was in charge of this new team. In 2018, in order to help analyze the DNA found on Brad's clothing, Boardman police detectives turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology company. As technology advanced, it opened up new possibilities for solving cases like Brad's. According to the criminal profile Parabon gave the Boardman police, they were probably looking for a man of European descent with fair or very fair skin, freckles, brown or hazel eyes, and black or brown hair. The list of possible suspects was then reduced by Parabon using familial DNA to identify a group of people who had similar family histories or physical traits. Detectives collected DNA samples from individuals identified by Parabon as potentially having familial ties to the unidentified suspect over the course of the next 4 years. They worked non-stop. They were able to narrow down their search to certain branches of the extended family tree and rule out others thanks to the results of those DNA tests. In the end, with the help of a DNA test, they narrowed in on a man known as Joseph Norman Hill. Investigators searched far and wide for Hill's relatives in order to collect DNA samples for analysis. In the end, the finding showed a 98.2% chance that the DNA on Brad's clothes belonged to Hill. At last, the investigators had solved the case and found the guilty party. But there was a major setback. The man identified by DNA testing, Joseph Norman Hill, was no longer alive. He was 79 years old when he lost his fight with cancer in 2019. And to make matters more difficult, his body had been cremated. Detectives were unable to confirm his involvement with additional tests on his remains due to this regrettable turn of events. There was little easily accessible information about Joseph Norman Hill's life when the investigators dug into his life. Their investigation was limited by the fact that his wife had died in 1993 and he had few family ties. But their investigation found that Hill, who lived on Shady Side Drive in Boardman, was 32 years old at the time of Brad's murder. He moved to California in 1978 for work-related reasons while working as a truck driver for a company that sold bottled water. There was no known connection between Brad's family and Hill. Hill's sole run-in with the law dates back to his conviction in 1986 for soliciting inappropriate behavior and disorderly conduct in Los Angeles. It took a total of slightly more than $29,000 to solve Brad's case after years of searching for DNA evidence. Nevertheless, the boy's family was able to find closure, so it was worth the expense. Authorities eventually came to the conclusion that they would have felt very confident in front of a grand jury in the event that Hill had been alive, and this would have led to an indictment, according to Boardman Police Chief Todd Worth, who made this announcement during a press conference on January 24, 2023. Brad's family had decided not to issue any public statements. In order to process the new information and carry on with their healing process, they asked for privacy. They were going through a difficult time, and the last thing they needed was media attention. However, the tale is not over yet. Hill was shockingly connected in June 2023 to the 1975 death of another young boy. A mile or so from the Bolino home, 13-year-old David Evans, a Boardman resident as well, vanished 3 years after Brad was kidnapped and killed. Evans' father notified the police that he had been absent for the majority of the evening, and at midnight on January 18, 1975, Evans was listed as missing. Evans, who had been absent for over 6 hours, had diabetes. Sadly, for days later, he was found dead and frozen on his back in the backyard of a house on Crestline Place in Boardman. According to the autopsy, Evans had a puncture wound on his lower back and fractures to his left forearm bones. These wounds had been caused following his passing. The report also mentioned several abrasions on his upper back and face. A profile found on Evans's underwear matched Hill's DNA after multiple DNA tests were done on his clothing, which were preserved by the police, proving his connection to this second murder. The fact that Brad's murder and Evans's murder have been solved after more than 50 years demonstrates the commitment and tenacity of law enforcement personnel, as well as the remarkable developments in DNA technology. Even though the offender will never face justice in a court of law, the community and the families of the victims benefit greatly from knowing who he is. In June 1980, Holly Campellia, a native of New Jersey, vanished following a period of poor mental health. Holly had been battling with mental issues since high school, but she became increasingly erratic when she got to college. One fateful day on her way to a counseling appointment, she jumped out of her mother's car and was never seen again. All her family knew at the time was that she hitchhiked to Sacramento. After sending her family one letter, Holly stopped contacting them. Immediately after her disappearance, her parents, Augustine and Sally Campellia, reported her missing. But unknowingly to them, her name was accidentally removed from the National Missing Persons Database. Meanwhile, in August 1980, the body of a 21-year-old woman was discovered in a cornfield off Seavers Road in Dixon, not far from the location of the current Pedrick Produce Market. She was dressed in a green wool sweater despite the summer heat and had been shot in the head numerous times. Detectives at the time had no idea that the woman's name had unintentionally been erased from the National Missing People database just 2 weeks prior. The victim and her murderer could not be identified, and so she was dubbed Dixon Jane Doe for 12 years. In 1992, when Augustine and Sally Campellia got to know that their daughter Holly Campellia had accidentally dropped from the missing persons database used by law enforcement, they contacted the officials to re-add her name into the database. 5 weeks later, the Campellias were informed by Solano County detectives that they had a match. Holly Ann was their Dixon Jane Doe. This was heartbreaking news for Holly's family. In an interview, her mother Sally sadly said, "I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren. But with each year, I'd lose a little hope." Even though Holly Ann could now be laid to rest properly, neither her family nor the police knew what had happened to her. The investigation was abandoned until 2021, when Holly Ann's relatives contacted the police to inquire about the possibility of using modern forensic methods to identify Holly Ann's killer. Investigators got to work, and a male's DNA was found after evidence samples of the crime scene were sent for testing. In 2023, investigators from the Solano County Sheriff's Office declared that they think the DNA belongs to Herman Lee Hobbs, who is currently 76 years old and serving a sentence at a prison in Chowchilla. According to research, Herman Lee Hobbs had been a violent criminal throughout his adult life. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, he was accused of carrying out more than a dozen armed robberies across the Sacramento region. Hobbs admitted to being the serial robber and consented to plead guilty after leading police on a wild car chase. However, when it was time for his sentence, the 6'5" mechanic attempted to flee the courthouse and had to be tackled and subdued by a CHP officer. Herman Lee Hobbs' time behind bars for armed robbery was brief. He was back on the streets by 1975. He relocated to Rio Linda, a street away from Terry Pata, a 13-year-old junior high school student. One day in January 1975, Terry Pata was sent home from school early due to her having nausea and a headache. She, however, never made it home. 9 days later, her body was discovered nearby, placed inside a drain pipe. She had been raped and fatally stabbed. At the time, no suspect was ever found. Years of sexual assault by Herman Lee Hobbs weren't made public until 2000. He was convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County that year. When Hobbs was taken into prison, his niece and daughter came forward to express concerns that he might be responsible for the deaths of numerous children. This tip led investigators to Terry Pata's long-suppressed murder. When DNA from Terry Pata's crime scene was examined, it matched Hobbs. Hobbs, who was already serving a lengthy jail sentence for rape, pled not guilty to Terry Pata's murder and was given a further 25 years to life sentence. This was just the start. That same year, some loggers discovered a woman's skull in the Yuba County foothills. Through DNA testing, the remains were identified as 29-year-old Brenda and Tucker, who vanished from her house in the area of Oroville in 1994. Hobbs was known to Brenda Tucker's loved ones. In the 1990s, he had occasionally even stayed at their home. Hobbs was accused of killing Tucker, but a court eventually dropped the charges in 2002 owing to a lack of proof. In 2023, after his DNA was a match to the DNA at Holly and Campellia's crime scene, Solano County investigators had Hobbs moved to the Justice Center Detention Facility in Fairfield. He is being charged with first-degree murder. According to the Solano County Sheriff's Office, investigators are collaborating with other organizations in Northern California to find any additional potential victims of Herman Lee Hobbs. The bodies of 16-year-old Donald Barton and 18-year-old Peter Zito were found at the Oak Hills Recreational Center in Aloha early on October 3, 1974 by a newspaper delivery man. The quiet neighborhood's residents were shaken and perplexed, finding it difficult to comprehend the act of violence that had taken place on their streets. The senseless crime sent shockwaves across the city, and for years detectives could not figure out who could have committed this. Who could have murdered these adolescent boys without cause? What might be the cause of this horrific murder? We are going to talk about a case today that went unsolved for 48 long years before justice was eventually served in 2022. Our current story takes place in Aloha, an unincorporated community in Oregon that is tucked between Beaverton and Hillsboro. Aloha provides all the amenities of thriving city, such as a post office, library, and schools despite not being incorporated. The elite Reserve Vineyards and Golf Club, renowned for its magnificent views and first-rate amenities, is the place where golfers can start their game. Beer enthusiasts can visit the 649 Tap House and Bottle Shop in the interim to sample new beers from their assortment of 20 taps featuring craft beer in Kumbuker. Rainy Day Games provides a variety of children's games, strategy games, and disc golf products. But in 1974, a senseless act of violence occurred in this sleepy community. In 1959, Donald Barton was born in the Orovan unincorporated community of Aloha. Irene Barton was the name of his mother. He used to live with his family and attended Aloha High School. Barton played hockey for his high school team and was an excellent player. Barton also had a part-time job at the popular Black Angus restaurant and worked nights at a recreation center. Born in 1957 in Aloha, Peter Zito attended Aloha High School. Zito used to play ice hockey whenever he had free time because he was also interested in the sport. Zito and Barton used to work at the recreational center at night. Although not much is known about his past, his personal life is revealed in an interview with Barbara Zito, his older sister. The people who knew him best said that he once treasured life's small pleasures. Zito was a kind little boy who loved his 1956 Oldsmobile and his 4 cats very much. Despite having left Aloha High School and started working as a dishwasher, he continued to hope to finish his diploma at Portland Community College. It serves as a reminder that, despite tragedies, there are tales of common people with aspirations and passions that should not be forgotten. 2 boys, Donald Barton, then 16, and Peter Zito Jr., then 18, were working on Zito's 1956 Oldsmobile car at 2 in the morning in the Oak Hills Recreation Center parking lot on a quiet October 3, 1974 evening. They were unaware that it would be their final night alive. While they were fiddling with the car's engine, an unidentified attacker came up to them and shot both of them, killing them instantly. The families and loved ones of these teenagers experienced a nightmare on what should have been a typical night. The following morning, an Oregonian newspaper delivery driver stumbled upon the crime scene and discovered the horror. It seemed as though time had stopped as the 2 boys lay lifeless. They had lost their youth, their dreams, and their future to the senseless violence. After seeing what he had seen at the crime scene, the newspaper delivery man called the police, trembling. Investigators and forensic specialists arrived in a matter of minutes, sirens blaring. The investigators were shocked and incredulous at the horrific scene. However, they did not waste any time in beginning the meticulous examination of the crime scene. Upon closer examination, it became evident that Donald Barton was repairing the 1956 Oldsmobile in the parking lot under the car's hood when he was brutally shot in the back of the head. It appeared as though he had been caught off guard while working on the engine, when his body was discovered slumped over the open hood of the vehicle. Peter Zito Jr., who was shot in the forehead after probably getting out of the back seat to see what had happened to Donald, was lying dead next to the Oldsmobile. Near the driver's door on the ground was where he was discovered. The fact that the 2 bodies were so close to one another indicated that the murderer had attacked without warning, and that the victims were powerless to protect themselves. Following the collection of all evidence from the crime scene, the investigators spoke with anyone who had been in the vicinity of the recreation center on the night of the killings. Regardless of how small the lead appeared, they pursued every potential lead. They inquired of every resident in the area whether they had heard any screams or seen any strange activity the night of the murder. To find any leads that would help them solve the case, the investigators put forth endless effort. They discovered that a .22 caliber gun had been used to shoot the teenage boys in the head. As they dug deeper, they discovered that Barton was in a rivalry with Chris, a 17-year-old co-worker at the popular Black Angus restaurant in Hillsborough. There was clearly tension between the 2 of them, even though nobody was quite sure what caused their feud. Even though Chris was the top suspect in many people's eyes, the police had to proceed cautiously with their investigation because they knew they could not afford to take any chances. Lacking hard proof, the investigators chose to look into another suspect even though they believed Chris had a motive for the murder. A man came forward during the Oak Hill murder investigation to report that he had seen Joseph Emma Wilson being attacked at the recreation center the night of the murders. Wilson may have shot Zeta and Barton in reprisal for the assault if he thought the boys were someone else, according to investigators. When Joseph Amir Wilson, an 18-year-old student at Aloha High School, was detained and accused of killing Donald Barton and Peter Zeta Jr. brutally, the Oak Hills double murder case took an upturn. When detectives dug deeper into the case, they discovered a cache of weapons and knives at Wilson's residence. During a search of his home, more than 100 knives and a variety of guns were discovered. A loaded .38 caliber gun that was concealed beneath Wilson's pillow was one of the weapons. Wilson revealed that the weapons belonged to his late father when investigators questioned him about them. All of the guns were sent for testing while his explanation was being looked into, and it turned out that none of them matched the weapon used in the savage killings of Zito and Barton. As they attempted to solve the mystery of who was behind the horrible crime, the investigation went on. Wilson amicably denied having anything to do with the crime, but the investigators were not ready to let him go. so they carried on with their investigation. The deeper the investigators dug into the case, the more they started to doubt Wilson's guilt. Wilson's defense team made a strong case throughout the trial that he was not to blame for Barton and Zito Jr. deaths. Wilson was not directly linked to the crime, and the prosecution's case was based primarily on circumstantial evidence. Wilson was eventually freed in spite of the uncertainties and unanswered questions. Many residents of the neighborhood began to feel uneasy, wondering if the murderer was still out there, prowling around among them. Because Chris was under 18, investigators did not question him despite their initial suspicions stemming from his conflict with Barton at their place of employment, the busy Black Angus restaurant in Hillsborough. They turned their attention to Wilson, another suspect, but when Wilson was declared not guilty, they turned back to Chris. This time, they looked into Chris more thoroughly. Investigators discovered a .22 caliber gun in Chris's car when he was arrested for theft, giving them fresh hope for a breakthrough in the case. Subsequently, the firearm was sent for examination to determine whether it was the same weapon used to kill the two boys. The gun could not be identified from the bullets found at the crime scene, so even with the encouraging lead, the investigation came to a standstill. The victims' families were left without answers and without justice as the months stretched into years and the case went cold. Everyone was left wondering whether the true events of that fateful night would ever come to light because the case remained unsolved. In an effort to put an end to this unsolved case, the Washington County Sheriff's Office resolved to reopen the investigation in 2022 and rerun ballistics on the .22 caliber gun that had been used to shoot Barton and Zito, the two defenseless teenage boys. Although Chris was suspected by the detectives at the time, they were unable to connect the murder scene with the gun that Chris had in his possession. But thanks to developments in forensic science and congruent matching cell technology, it was ultimately established that the same gun was used in both killings and that it matched a 1979 murder that had been committed. Police were taken aback by the owner's identity when they investigated who owned this gun. It was none other than Chris, the teenage boy that the authorities had long since suspected. In order to learn more about Chris's activities in the years after the killings, investigators looked closely where he was at the time. Mark Allen Chris, who was eventually found to be the murderer in the double murder case, was 65 years old and resided in Aloha, a small town 12 miles west of Portland. When it was found that the .22 caliber gun used in the murders of Donald Barton and Peter Zito Jr. had also been used in another horrific killing. The story surrounding the gun took a dark turn. After the investigators released Chris in 1974 because the gun's ballistics did not match, the gun was given back to him and he took it with him to the U.S. Army base at Fort Lewis in Washington. On October 8, 1979, nearly 5 years after Barton and Zito's deaths, Chris murdered Surgeon Jacob Kim Brown, his commanding officer. They're using the same weapon. After a small quarrel, Chris shot his boss 5 times in the head. Police reports state that the cadet had caused damage to Brown's car, and after an argument, he decided to end his life rather than pay for repairs. Chris received a 35-year prison term for the killing of Surgeon Brown. Fate had other ideas for him. In 1988, after serving just 12 years on parole, he was freed. The victim's family was not pleased with this decision. But when the case was reopened in 2022, he was finally out of luck. It was revealed that the match was the same .22 caliber gun that had been used to kill Zito and Barton at the recreation center in 1974. On November 2, 2022, Chris, who was residing in Aloha, a small town 12 miles west of Portland, was taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. People in the town were shocked to learn of his arrest and were in disbelief that, after all these years, justice had finally been served. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives described Chris's arrest and the gun match's confirmation as of historic moment, noting that it was the oldest known match in the country to be verified. For the families of Donald Barton and Peter Zito Jr., who had to wait nearly 50 years for justice to be done, it was a momentous occasion. The reopening of this case and the suspect's apprehension were evidence of the detectives' perseverance and hard work in trying to apprehend the murderer. It also offered other families of cold case victims hope that, in spite of the length of time it might take, justice might still be served. After decades of waiting, The victims' families' unwavering commitment to securing justice for their loved ones has finally paid off. The sheriff's office wished to honor their dedication and the bravery required to persevere for such a long time. However, the sheriff's office unintentionally harmed an innocent man in their pursuit of justice. Within hours of the killings, Joseph Emil Wilson was detained and accused of the killings, but it was immediately evident that he was not guilty. Although the charges against him were withdrawn, the harm had already occurred. In the hopes that they will be able to apologize directly to Wilson's family someday, the sheriff's office formally apologized to any of Wilson's relatives for this injustice. In order to provide the victims' families with closure and justice, several agencies collaborated on the case. The ATF, the CID, the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and the Oregon State Crime Lab were all instrumental in cracking this case. Now that the murderer has been apprehended, the sheriff's office hopes that the victim's family can finally find closure. Although the loss of a loved one never fully heals, it can be comforting to know that the guilty party has been brought to justice. Sheriff Pat Garrett approached the podium during the press conference and looked around the room before focusing on the victims' families. Knowing that they had been in pain for more than 48 years, his heart went out to them. One of the family members, Barbara Zito, the sister of Peter Zito, could not help but recall her brother as the carefree young man he used to be before his life was tragically cut short. She listened to the sheriff's words, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. There were a lot of questions raised along with a sense of relief upon learning of Chris's arrest. The victim's family knew their loved one's pain would never truly go away, even as they accepted the long overdue justice. This knowledge permeated their emotions as they left the news conference. Although it took a while to find closure, they could now finally find solace in the knowledge that the murderer was in prison. Though it is unsettling to consider that the case involving Donald Barton and Peter Zito went unresolved for more than 48 years, justice was eventually served because of the commitment and tenacity of law enforcement and forensic investigators. It serves as a reminder that the truth will always surface, regardless of how long it takes. Unknown circumstances led to the untimely death of Sylvia Quail on August 4, 1981. Sylvia Quail, a devoted sister and daughter, was discovered dead in her Cherry Hills Village apartment at the age of 34 with a white towel covering her face. The murderer evaded authorities for years, and even after a thorough investigation, it appeared that the case would never be resolved. Her brutal murder remained one of Colorado's most puzzling cold cases for more than 40 years. What possible reason could there be for this horrible deed? How was the case ultimately resolved by the investigators? Cherry Hills Village, a wealthy municipality in Arapahoe County, Colorado, is the setting for today's case. With a population of about 6,500, it is well known for its most expansive estates, opulent residences, and stunning natural surroundings. With its top-notch parks, schools, and recreational opportunities, the city offers its citizens a high quality of life and a strong sense of community. The Cherry Hills Country Club, which has played host to numerous important golf tournaments over the years, is also located there. This tranquil municipality is the site of a horrifying incident that happened in 1981. On September 23, 1946, Sylvia Quail, the eldest child of William and Mary Quail, was born in Cherry Hills Village. Sylvia had a wonderful spirit from an early age and a contagious laugh that could make anyone's day. Everyone in her community admired her lively and amiable personality. She was always willing to help those in need and had a heart of gold. Sylvia had an unwavering love for Jo Quail, her younger sister. She was very loving and caring toward her younger sister, who she cherished. In her community, Sylvia was well known for her generosity and kindness. She was also highly respected by everyone who knew her for her unselfish willingness to help others without hesitation. Sylvia Quail was a multi-talented woman whose ambition and optimism were apparent in every facet of her life. After graduating from Englewood High School in 1964, Sylvia decided to pursue a career in architecture and history due to her strong interest in both subjects. Sylvia's love of architecture was ingrained in her, and she counted herself lucky to have an uncle named Wesley Quail, who was a well-known architect in the area. In an attempt to find ideas for her own projects, Sylvia would frequently spend hours poring over her uncle's numerous blueprints and designs. Sylvia was not scared to follow her dreams and passions, in spite of the social morals of the time. She paved the way for women to pursue careers in architecture by demonstrating that anything is achievable with perseverance and hard effort. Sylvia Quail left a lasting impression on everyone she met thanks to her upbeat outlook, generosity, and unrestrained ambition. Her legacy continues to encourage young women to follow their passions and aspirations despite any obstacles they may encounter. With her diverse talents and passions, which she pursued with zeal and tenacity, Sylvia was a real multifaceted gem. Her hobbies demonstrated her love of creativity, particularly her amazing pottery work that astounded everyone. Her distinctive and endearing pottery creations were much loved by her friends and family, and receiving one as a gift was always a delight. However, she did not take cooking lightly, and it had a special place in her heart among all her hobbies. She even made the decision to launch her own wedding cake company, dubbed the Buttery, out of her passion. This was a huge hit with her clients. Everyone was left wanting more after tasting her exquisite and expertly made cakes. Sylvia was fiercely independent, but she never lost sight of the value of family. She was very close to both her parents and Jo, her younger sister. She had a loving family, and it showed in the way she treated everyone around her. Her contagious positivity and kind nature were a reflection of that. Sylvia Quail and her parents had an unbreakable bond. Situated in the 3800 block of South Arden Street, just a short distance from their daughter's residence, William and Mary Quail would start their day with a cozy cup of coffee and attend a discussion with their eldest child. The most important people in Sylvia's life were her parents, and her disposition improved the day routine for her family. They had no idea what horror was in store for them. The Quail family was unaware that August 3rd, 1981 would be remembered as a tragic day for all time. Sylvia promised to come back the following morning as they enjoyed their morning coffee together. Unbeknownst to everyone, Sylvia departed for work as usual, but this would be the last time they would ever see her. When Sylvia talked to her sister on the phone that evening, they joked and laughed as usual without realizing it would be their last exchange. On August 4th, the following morning, Sylvia did not arrive at her parents' house for their customary coffee in the morning. Knowing that Sylvia would never skip their daily ritual without telling them caused her parents to become concerned. When they tried to call her landline, nobody picked up. Now, even more worried, Sylvia's father William raced to her house, which was only 150 feet away. William's heart raced with fear as he got closer to her house. He had a strong suspicion that something was seriously off. Sadly, his worst nightmares came true when he got there. The Quail family would always remember that day. William arrived home to find the house filled with an unsettling quiet. He was startled to see that the wooden entrance and security screen were both flume wide open, inviting him inside as he drew closer to the front door. Fear descended upon him like a thick shroud as he cautiously entered the living room, and he saw Sylvia lying on the ground, motionless. With her body twisted into an unusual pose, her arms lifted above her head, seemingly in a last-ditch request for assistance. William would never be able to forget the horrific scene that he saw. His hand trembled as he reached out to remove the white towel from Sylvia's face, hiding the most exposed part of her body. Though at the time it seemed like the only thing he could do, it was a modest act of respect for the daughter who meant the world to him. Officers Gerald Marks and Jack DeVole of the Cherry Hills Village Police Department responded to 3800 South Ogden Street right away when William, who was shaking, dialed 911 for assistance at around 7:57 in the morning. What they discovered was a horrifying and gory scene. Surgeon Richard Crowles and Detective Harry Whitman also showed up to support the investigation. Even the most seasoned police officers would have shuddered in horror at the crime scene. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was called in to help with the investigation and processing of the crime scene because the police department realized they needed all the assistance they could get to solve this horrible crime. Experienced CBI agents like Watchin, Wayne Bryant, and Howard Gillespie were present, giving some hope that the person responsible for this horrific crime would be apprehended and prosecuted. Seeing the crime scene was unsettling. Their gazes swept over the entire space when the detective entered. It was clear right away how the offender had entered the house through the wide-open front door and the security screen door. There were obvious blood stains on the floor, and the living room was in a messy state. Certain spots, such as the vicinity of the front door and a short distance from Sylvia's lifeless body, appear to have a concentration of blood. The investigators saw a medium-sized kitchen knife with a blood-stained silver blade lying next to the body as they got closer to the body. Surprisingly, they also discovered a white glow-style shirt, possibly placed there by the murderer, lying over the knife's handle. It looked like a scene from a horror film, and the detectives knew they would have a challenging task ahead of them in trying to solve this horrible crime. Detective Whitman felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked around the scene. It was enough to make his stomach turn to see Sylvie's lifeless body lying on the ground with her red shirt pulled over her face. But what really got his attention were the marks that were clearly visible on her body. Her bloodied hands gave the impression that she had battled for her life, and her broken fingernails were a visible reminder of the hardship she must have endured. He looked at her neck. The marks there looked like fingers, suggesting that she had been strangled. There was a mystery to be solved regarding the red marks on her inner thighs. The detective's attention was drawn to the blood-stained pillow in the bedroom. The quantity of blood on it was a good indicator of how serious the attack was. Looking around, he saw that Sylvia had no chance of getting help because the telephone cord was severed. It was clear that the murderer had carefully thought out the attack and ensured Sylvia was alone and defenseless. A feeling of dread overcame Detective Whitman as he looked through the scene again. This was no typical crime. Rather, it was a horrifying act that required quick attention to solve. The odd condition of the outside phone line leading to the victim's home caught Detective Whitman's attention as he inspected the outside of the house. It was taken with reckless abandon and slum across the hood of Sylvia's 1974 brown Corvette, looking more like a macabre ornament. The culprit behind this sabotage, according to the investigation, was a garden hose that was hurled over the line and mercilessly pulled down, leaving behind telltale black marks. It was evident that the offender did not hesitate to use homemade instruments for their evil purposes. There was also proof that the attacker had made several attempts to break in. Investigators discovered a tiny puncture in a bedroom window screen, indicating a botched attempt. But the bathroom window was not so fortunate. The screen vanished and was subsequently discovered 50 feet from the house, concealed among some tall weeds. The wooden frame was found to have been left unlocked, making it an easy target for the intruder. It also had a prime mark on the bottom, indicating that it had been tampered with. Sylvia Quail's brutal murder left a horrifying trail of evidence, and her body was sent for an autopsy after the crime scene was examined. The startling truth about Sylvia's death came to light following the autopsy performed by Arapahoe County Coroner John Wood. Sylvia had been struck by a .22 caliber bullet to the head. She was stabbed 3 times in the upper back, strangled, and most likely assaulted. Dr. Wood, an experienced coroner, swabbed various parts of Sylvia's body to preserve any potential forensic evidence, including microscopic slides made from the swabs taken from inside her body. According to Dr. Wood's report, Sylvia died from exsanguination brought on by multiple posterior chest stab wounds that lacerated the altar and both lungs. He also found that Sylvia had a gunshot wound to the head and extracted 2 bullet fragments from her brain. The horrific nature of her last moments was revealed in the autopsy report that followed. Her life was taken by a gunshot wound, several stab wounds, strangulation, and possibly an assault. There is no doubt that Sylvia's death was the consequence of an incredibly violent act carried out by an unidentified attacker. Dr. Wood reported that the death was a homicide, so law enforcement will have their hands full trying to find the person responsible and bring them to justice. With a ton of forensic evidence left behind, the case had all the makings of a classic coujinet, giving investigators hope that they would soon find the culprit. However, it became more and more obvious that this was no typical investigation as the days stretch into weeks and then months. Even with their greatest efforts, the local police force was having trouble moving forward. The lack of technology and tangible leads make it difficult to follow even the smallest pieces of evidence. With DNA technology still in its infancy in the early 1980s, the identity of the bodily fluid discovered at the scene remained little more than a mystery. Investigators were left scratching their heads, wondering how they were ever going to break through in this seemingly unsolvable case, without a registered sex offender profile to work from. Detectives meticulously examined the murder scene of Sylvia Quail and gathered about 140 pieces of evidence. Not until 2 years following the murder was a noteworthy discovery made. A different light source was employed by forensic experts in 1983 to identify any possible foreign objects on the orange area rock that had been gathered from the spot where Sylvia Quail had died. Subsequent examination revealed the substance to be male DNA. This finding offered investigators a new avenue to pursue in their pursuit of justice, as well as an essential piece of evidence for the investigation. For years, there had been little to no advancement in the murder of Sylvia, with the case languishing in the archives. However, a ray of hope appeared on the horizon for the investigators in 1985 when Otis L. Waddell, a notorious drifter and serial killer, confessed to her murder. He gave the detective a detailed account of the trees and hedges surrounding her house, giving rise to the prospect that justice would eventually be done. However, doubts arose about Toole's confessions and those of his companion, Henry Lee Lucas. Authorities were only able to confirm a small number of the hundreds of murders that Lucas, who passed away in a Texas prison in 2001, claimed to have committed. The kidnapping and murder of Adam Walsh, the son of America's most wanted broadcaster, John Walsh, in Hollywood, Florida, was among the most notorious crimes that Toole admitted to. Years after Toole's confession to Adam's murder was later retracted, Hollywood police officials said they had closed the case because they were certain Toole was the murderer. After he made this confession, investigators thought he might have killed Sylvia. But the Arapahoe County District Attorney, Bob Gallagher, dropped the charges against Toole in 1993. This resulted from DNA testing on the evidence, which demonstrated that Toole was not the source of the DNA discovered 12 years earlier at the crime scene. It appeared as though a sudden gust of wind carried it away, the meager thread of hope that had sustained the Quail family and the detectives. The case reverted to its initial state. A portion of the carpet that was kept for additional testing turned out to be very important evidence in 1995. 5 years later, in 2000, the results of the testing conducted on the sample by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation revealed an unidentified male DNA profile. As investigators entered the profile into Cody's, the FBI's combined DNA index system excitement mounted. Unfortunately, no match was discovered. For many years, the law enforcement agencies struggled to find answers in the murder of Sylvia Quail. Even after the most recent technologies were used in the investigation and every lead was investigated with the utmost care, the case remained unsolved. Sylvia's family was waiting impatiently for any information regarding the case. Despite their best efforts, the murder of Sylvia remained a mystery for many years, leaving the family grieving and many questions unanswered. There was an advancement in Sylvia Quail's case following years of quiet. In 2019, Metro Denver Crime Stoppers partnered with United Data Connect, a genetic genealogy-focused company founded by former Denver District Attorney Mitch Morrissey. They employed a technique that had previously assisted in the resolution of several unsolved cold cases around the nation. The infamous Golden State Killer in California was identified thanks to this creative technique. Crime Stoppers received a renewed interest in the case in January 2020 from Cherry Hills Village cold case detectives and investigator Matt Hannigan of the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office. After 4 months of hard work, on May 26, 2020, the company's technicians had a name, David Dwayne Anderson. This was because technological advancements made it possible to further the investigation using cutting-edge familial DNA investigations. After all these years, the revelation of Anderson's identity had given Sylvia's case a glimmer of hope for justice. Koza, Nebraska is a sleepy town, and its residents had no idea that one of them was involved in a violent 1981 murder case. The 61-year-old David Dwayne Anderson had been living a peaceful, seemingly routine life in this tiny, mostly unpopulated town. However, very few people were aware that more than 30 years prior Anderson was residing in Englewood, only a few miles away, when the horrific murder of Sylvia Quail rocked Cherry Hills Village to its foundations. As detectives dug further into David Dwayne Anderson's past, a pattern of illegal activity became apparent. In the years after Sylvia Quail's murder, Anderson had committed at least 8 burglaries. In a few of these, he had worn gloves to hide his fingerprints. This disclosure has only strengthened the growing body of evidence against him. Anderson had even taken off a window screen in one break-in, mimicking the actions of Sylvia's killer to gain entry to the house. The evidence was starting to come together, and Anderson's involvement in the crime appeared more plausible. If found guilty of the murder, Anderson would have received the same sentence that was in place when Sylvia was killed, a lifetime in prison with the possibility of release after 20 years. But first-degree murder convictions are currently unpardonable under state law. The argument against Anderson was growing stronger by the day, and the stakes were very high. Robert Fuller, a United Data Connect investigator, went to Cozad on January 16, 2021 without his knowledge in order to collect his DNA. On January 18, 2021, after Anderson threw 2 trash bags into a nearby dumpster, Fuller a close eye on Anderson's movements from outside his apartment complex. The 15 bags held potential genetic material belonging to Anderson, which could give investigators the lead they need to crack the case of the long-running murder. It had worked out well for Detective Fuller's covert mission to obtain DNA evidence from David Dwayne Anderson. From Anderson's garbage bags, he had retrieved a few things, including an intriguing assortment of drinks. Among the items found were a can of vanilla Coke, an inexpensive water bottle, a bottle of spiced rum, and a bottle of Michelob Ultra beer. At a travel stop in Sterling, Colorado, Fuller met with an investigator and gave the evidence. Each item bagged separately for the CBI to examine further. On January 29, 2021, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation gave detectives their eagerly anticipated report following a week of investigation. According to the report, there was a match between the male DNA profile from the confiscated vanilla Coke can and the DNA found on several items gathered during Sylvia Quail's homicide investigation. The DNA evidence was unquestionably convincing and established Anderson's link to the crime scene. Subsequent analysis of the gathered data revealed that DNA from Anderson was discovered on the crime scene rug and on swabs taken from Sylvia's corpse during her autopsy. Moreover, a swab taken from Sylvia's left breast contained Anderson's DNA as well. It was shocking to learn that Sylvia's blood and Anderson's biological fluid were mixed together in the white towel that had been found covering her face. This proved that Anderson was the one who had murdered Sylvia brutally. On February 10, 2021, in Nebraska, David Dwayne Anderson was apprehended for the murder of Sylvia Quail after decades of hiding a deadly and sinister secret. He returned to Colorado voluntarily to answer to charges of first-degree felony murder and first-degree murder after deliberate thought. The case's prosecutors were committed to seeing Sylvia's rights upheld and making sure Anderson was made to answer for his deeds. District Attorney Grant Grosgebauer, a deputy for the 18th Judicial District, said the defendant had a dark secret that was ultimately disclosed during the trial. After so many years, the truth would finally be revealed. Anderson, the person suspected of killing Sylvia Quail over 40 years ago, has been found guilty following a protracted and difficult legal battle. 3 months after the trial ended in a hung jury on March 25, 2022, it was retried, and on June 30th of that year, the verdict was rendered. On August 4, 2022, Anderson, who is currently 62 years old, was scheduled to be sentenced. The punishment he received would be determined by the legislation in force at the time of the murder and could include a life sentence with the possibility of release after 20 years. For the friends and family of Quail, who have been waiting decades for justice to be done, this verdict represents the end of a torturous and protracted journey. Justice was at last served for Sylvia Quail, who was brutally murdered in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado nearly 40 years ago. Mitch Morrissey, the creator of United Data Connect, expressed his condolences to the Quail family, especially to her father who discovered a lifeless body. As a father of a young woman himself, the unsettling details of the crime left him in shock. Nevertheless, Sylvia's parents were not present to see their daughter's murderer apprehended. Mary Quail died 10 years after her husband, William Quail, in 1999. Their hearts were left with an enormous void that would never be filled after losing their daughter. Sylvia's vibrant personality and her unwavering love for those she held dear were always missed by her family and friends. It had been much anticipated that suspect David Dwayne Anderson would be arrested in Nebraska in February 2021. And the trial that followed was not without its difficulties. The 18th Judicial District prosecutors persevered and eventually won a guilty verdict for Anderson on both counts of first-degree murder after deliberation and felony murder, despite the first trial ending in a hung jury. Grant Grosgrauber, the deputy district attorney, discussed the defendant's dark secret, which had been kept a secret for more than 40 years before the trial revealed it. Chris Gallo, the chief deputy district attorney, conveyed his appreciation to the detectives and forensic scientists who toiled diligently on the case, not allowing the passage of time to hinder their pursuit of justice. For Quail's family, who had been waiting for justice for more than 40 years, the verdict provided some closure. John Kellner, the district attorney, emphasized the case's significance in demonstrating that justice can ultimately triumph even in the face of a lengthy delay. This decision serves as a warning to any murderer who believes they have gotten away with their crimes. Justice may take longer to arrive, but it will eventually do so. Justice has finally been served after more than 40 years, all thanks to the unwavering efforts of law enforcement and forensic specialists who are not willing to give up on this case. Though it is unable to bring back Sylvia and her infectious spirit, it serves as a warning to all killers that they cannot hide from justice and will always be held accountable for their horrific deeds. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.